All right, we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, starting in verse 12. We're going to go through 23. And the question that is being explored by Solomon in this particular section is the question, what is going to happen with your legacy? What is your legacy? And uncreatively, that's the title for tonight. What is your legacy? So starting here in verse 12, we read, "And I turned myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do that cometh after the king? Even that which hath already done. Then I saw that wisdom excelleth folly, as far as light excelleth darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walketh in darkness. And I myself perceived also that one event happeneth to them all. Then I said in my heart, As it happeneth to the fool, so it happeneth even to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For there is no remembrance of the wise more than of the fool forever. Seeing that which now is in the days to come shall be not forgotten. And how dieth the wise man? As a fool. Therefore I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me. For all is vanity and a vexation of spirit. Yea, I hated all my labor which I had taken under the sun, because I should leave it unto the man that shall be after me. And who knoweth whether he shall be a wise man or a fool? Yet shall he have rule over all my labor, wherein I have labored, and wherein I have showed myself wise under the sun? This is also vanity. Therefore I went about to cause my heart to despair of all the labor which I took under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is in wisdom, and in knowledge, and in equity. Yet to a man that hath not labored, therein shall he leave it for his portion. This also is vanity, and a great evil. For what hath man of all his labor, and all of the vexation of his heart, wherein he hath labored under the sun? For all his days are sorrows, and his travail grief, yea, his heart taketh not rest in the night. This is also vanity." All right, we'll open it up in a word of prayer and then dive into the text here. Father, I just thank you so much for your word and the wisdom that you give us. Help us as believers just continue to seek after you in deeper ways than simply being content with milk, being content with the very obvious things. I pray that you would use your word in all of its variety, in all of its ability, in all of its diversity, to challenge us as believers, to open our minds, broaden that, so that we are thinking in ways that really touch more than just one part or one aspect of the sphere of our influence. And Father, I pray that you'd have your will done in our life, and that you would mold us into the image of your Son, Jesus Christ. And I say this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, so there's basically two main sections in this portion here. And he's dealing with the question, the big question is, when I die, what happens to all my stuff? I worked hard for all of this stuff, and I'm just handing it over to somebody else. And I don't know if that person's going to be a good person or a bad person. I don't know if they're going to act wisely with my stuff. I worked so hard for it, and I was so wise with all of my things, and I really took the time to develop very well, as we looked in previously, how he developed his gardens, and he expanded his territories, and he amassed all these slaves and everything. I mean, he was very, very wealthy. And yet, he knows that at the end of the day, he's going to have to hand it over to somebody else. And maybe that person's good, maybe they're not. Maybe they're really great stewards, maybe they're not. You can't see the future. But even if the person is as wise as he is with all of these things, there is something that they have in common. Whether they're wise or they're foolish, both will be in the grave. And then what? And so one of the biggest themes that we see peppered all throughout Ecclesiastes is the dealing with labor. As we've seen, what's the point of laboring? What's the point of doing all this work? What's the point of diving into, with all heart, mind, soul, and strength into the things that we do if at the end of the day it doesn't mean anything? And then in death, what is the point of all these things since everybody has exactly the same outcome? We all die. And so that's the really big question in here is labor and death. And we're going to see that all through Ecclesiastes. What is my legacy when I worked so hard for it? In verse 12, he says, "And I turned myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly." So he's referring to all the previous things that he talked about. That he had went with his eyes wide open. He was experimental in the way that he approached all of these ideas. He wanted to explore comedy and laughing at things and mirth. And he wanted to explore joy and ecstasy and even drunkenness. I mean, he went with his eyes wide open to see what the end of these things really are. And he says, at the end of the day, all these things are just like trying to herd wind. It's like a continuous cycle that never has an end. There's no real point in it all. And now he looks to his labor that he's handing over. Okay, so what if I did everything right? What if I had a great life and I amassed all this wealth and I handed over to somebody? What's the point? So I turned myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do that cometh after the king, even that which hath already been done? So he's talking about the person that's coming in after him. What difference does it make whether this person comes after me is good or bad, whether they're wise or foolish? Then I saw, this is verse 13, then I saw that wisdom excelleth folly as far as light excelleth darkness. So remember how he always drops these little proverbs, right? He does the hard work of a person who really looks at life, and he goes and he does almost in an experimental way. Okay, so if we have this logical presupposition, and this is A and this is B, and we have these propositions here, then C must be true. So 2 plus 2 equals 4, but in a way that is experiential. I know that the outcome is always going to be X, Y, or Z in every single one of these cases. If I drink, I'm going to get drunk, and it's meaningless. It doesn't have any value to it. If I laugh at the end of the day, yeah, I was tickled for a little bit, but at the end of the day, what does it mean? It doesn't mean really anything. It has no real meaning in and of itself. There's no inherent value to it. And so he does this with all these different experiences. And he drops these little proverbs, and this is one of those proverbs that he drops. And this is one of the proverbs that really it sheds some light on how it is that Solomon moves through experience and then comes up with these very, very unique and applicable statements that are so relatable that we look at this and it's like, man, that is just so good. Like that really speaks to me. And this is what he says. He says that wisdom excelleth folly. It actually is better than folly. In the same way as light is better than darkness. So we know that light and darkness, metaphorically speaking, when it comes to Solomon's Proverbs, are representative of something. These metaphors represent godliness and wisdom, and foolishness, folly, and sinfulness. So we have the godly person and the ungodly person. The person who lives in a godly way, yeah, that is far better in their life than it is to live as a complete fool. But he's only speaking at this point in terms of consequences. So we all know this proverb here. We hear it all the time. You reap what you sow. Why is it better? Well, the person who lives in a wise way is going to actually reap a good harvest in his life. He's actually going to bring good things into his life. And I think one of the most practical ways of thinking about this, like in a modern setting, like in America, is like when you talk to somebody who is in high school and they're wondering about their life. You know how they're always dropping these tests, right? You take the SATs and you sit there and you take these these intelligence evaluations and things, then they're trying to set you up for life. Like, this is what you're really good at. You're really great at science. I was really great at science, but I was really terrible at math. And so they basically said, you have no purpose in life. If you're really great at science, but you're terrible at math, there's no point. That's what I wanted to do anyway. But they try to set you up for life. They tell you what direction you're going to go based on what you do well. The interesting thing about that is that as you are being tested and evaluated, and as you're being told, like, this is what you're really good at and everything, there's one thing that they do not tell you, and that is, if you don't follow their path, that doesn't mean that you won't succeed. You don't have to go to college in order to be successful. You don't have to have a 10-year degree in order to be successful. It's the thing that they're missing out on. It's this other side, and it looks like this. If you graduate in America, if you graduate from high school, if you don't have children out of wedlock, if you get married and have children within marriage, and if you get a job, doesn't matter what the job is, if you get a job and you stick with that job and you don't jump around, you will have an amazing life, typically. Things will turn out very, very well for you. And it's such a simple thing. 2 + 2, 4. It's so easy. All you have to do is follow this pattern, and it almost always turns out, and that's reaping what you sow. If I sow things that are going to have good outcomes, I'll probably get good outcomes. That is just the principle of Scripture. And again, this is just consequences. These are just natural consequences, so kind of like stepping on a rake, right? If I step on a rake, I really can't blame the rake. I can't shake my fist at God, and I really can't blame myself. It's just cause and effect. It's just built into nature. That's just the way the universe works. And in a moral sense, in an ethical sense, in a work ethic sense, it's the same. If I apply these very simple things to life, good outcomes. But if I don't, well, we all know that paths lead to places. And that place can be very, very dark, or it can be really, really great. And so that's the proverb he drops on us. You reap what you sow. It is better to do good than bad because of outcomes, because of consequences. But then he's back to this question. Even if the outcome is great, even if I did everything right, and I have all this wealth, and life is just amazing for me, I'm going to die someday. I'm going to be in the grave. So what's the point? The wise man's eyes, is in verse 14. Again, this is going along with this proverb, this parable sort of that he puts, this metaphorical thing that he says before in verse 13. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walketh in darkness. And I myself perceived also that one event happeneth to them all. What is it? Yeah, we all die. Then I said in my heart, so now he's trying to work this out in his mind. He's like, okay, so yeah, the consequences are better if I do kind of reap what you sow and I actually follow a good path. The consequences are better. I've experienced these bad consequences of drinking and doing all these horrible things. It leads to a really bad end. But then I had to ask myself a question. Then I said in my heart, verse 15, as it happeneth to the fool, so it happeneth even to me. And why was I then more wise? Why did I spend all this time trying to do good, trying to do it right? Why did I spend so much time laboring, both physically and mentally, over this idea of gaining good things in my life? Why did I do it in the first place? Then I said in my heart that this also is vanity. In other words, it's an enigma. It's a mystery. I can't unravel exactly how this relates to the big question. And we all know that big question is, what is my purpose? Why do I exist? Why am I here on earth? Now he's going to kind of expand on this. He wants to explain to us what led him to ask this question. Verse 16, he says, for there is no remembrance of the wise more than of the fool forever. Seeing that which is now in the day to come shall all be forgotten. And how dieth the wise man? Same as the fool. They both meet their end. They both are in the same place. Now, there's a really great study that I think everybody ought to do, and that is to study the idea of death and how it's perceived in the Old Testament. Because oftentimes you'll read Psalms from David where he talks about there being no remembrance, that the person just ceases to kind of think and everything. And so this idea of soul sleep kind of sneaks into these sort of fringe groups like Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists and such. And they'll say things like that because of verses like this. It's exactly the same end. Well, they're not talking about their eternal state. They're talking about what death means in the physical world. And so I'm just going to throw this out here. It's kind of the way that J.R.R. Tolkien speaks about death when it comes to humans. Everybody in his books has a specific place that they go to, but when it comes to humans, it's a complete mystery. He never actually talks or expands about that idea, and I think that he's copying the mentality of the Old Testament believers when it comes to death. Now, I'm not saying that they didn't have some concept of being with God. I'm not saying that. But for the most part, when they speak about it, they speak of it in such a way that this is a really mysterious, difficult thing to understand. But just standing from the outside, when we're alive, we look at anybody who dies, and we would have to conclude it's the same for everybody. Because we don't have spiritual sight. We don't see things except for what God has told us. So they don't have all the information yet, and that's his idea, is that everybody is going to be forgotten and their life is meaningless. We talked about a little while back about how important memory is. If you can't remember anything in your life, what is your life? It only has meaning in the minds of the people who surround you. Well, that's a naturalistic way of looking at it, but we all know that God sees it, right? It's that age-old question. If a tree falls in the middle of the forest and nobody's around, does it make a sound? Yeah, Danny, you're pretty certain about that. You're like, yes, it makes a sound. Why do you say it makes a sound? But only if you're there to observe it. And that's their point. If you don't observe it, then you never know, and therefore it's meaningless. It doesn't have any, there's no sense in trying to explain that it makes a sound or not. And what they miss, and this is what Mortimer Adler actually says in his 10 Philosophical Mistakes of Modern Philosophy, the mistake that they make is that they ignore the glaring problem that God sees everything. So all things are stored up in the memory of God, and he is eternal. And so everything does have meaning because God's memory never ceases. His memory is never thwarted or wrong or incorrect. Everything is wrapped up. It's tied to the very nature of God's existence. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind, because if God knows, then it means something. So you can ask the same question: if somebody steals $5 and nobody's around, did he really steal $5? Well, yes, because God knows, right? So God is the one who actually sees it. Okay, I have to use this one illustration too. You probably have heard this before. The 3 blind men and the elephant. Have you guys ever heard that illustration? So you have an elephant, right? And it's supposed to be a commentary in postmodernism and why we can't ever have absolute meanings, okay? So you have this elephant and you have these 3 blind men. And you have this emperor or whatever says, okay, I want you to go up to this elephant and I want you to take a hold of it and I want you to tell me what an elephant is. And so the first blind man goes and he grabs the trunk and he says, well, an elephant is this really long, kind of elastic, thick and strong thing, like a snake. Very, very wide, like the trunk of a tree. And then another guy goes and he grabs the leg and he says, oh, no, this is an unyielding, immalleable thing that's just really, really thick and strong, and it is kind of like a tree, but it's not like what he said. And then the last guy grabs a hold of the tail and says, wow, actually, no, it's just really short, tiny thing with hair at the bottom, and it's even more than just malleable. It's almost like a slinky. Well, who's right? How do you know? How can you ever know if you're right if you only have a little piece of information? And that's what the postmodernists will tell you. Well, everybody's right at the same time, even though they seem to contradict. They're missing one very important aspect of the story. Every single one of us has seen an elephant, and we're not blind. The person who sees the whole elephant knows the whole truth. God sees everything, and he has the whole truth. So we're not all sitting around here trying to figure out who God is. God is telling us, right? We're not all trying to figure out what morality is. God tells us what morality is, and so on and so forth. So God sees everything, but in our limited scope, and this is from the perspective of experience, he's saying it's the same. It's exactly the same. Verse 17, therefore, I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me, for all is vanity, or is an enigma and vexation of spirit. So this is a really awesome question for today. And the reason it is that you run into people who are naturalists, right? I've run into so many atheists who are very staunch naturalists. And I'll ask them, what is the purpose of life? What is the meaning of life? And they're like, well, I mean, you find meaning in procreation and having children. You find meaning in helping your fellow man. You find meaning. And they're doing exactly the same thing that Solomon is doing. I'm making all these wise decisions on this side, and I'm getting all these great returns in this life. But what is the problem with that if you're a naturalist? At the end of your life, what meaning does it have? And they'll respond with this: I get to pass on my legacy. I get to pass on to my children, and then my children's children, and so on and so forth. And therefore, I have this lasting memory through my family, through my legacy. And they'll say that's the answer. But they haven't been honest with the end of their life, because they know that at some point our sun will burn out. They know at some point our universe will die, a heat death. So what's the point? It's that famous photograph, the pale blue dot. Have you seen that? It's a picture of the earth from hundreds and hundreds of millions of miles away. And it's just this, you could barely even see it, a little speck. And they say, oh, we're insignificant. Yes, if God doesn't exist, we are insignificant. Life is insignificant. All the history of the world is insignificant. It is meaningless. And that is when people, if they are honest, become nihilists. That is to say that since everything has no meaning, there's no point to living. And so they do exactly the same thing that Solomon does, says, I hate life. I hate this. I hate that I have to work all the time and I have to do all these things. If it all means nothing, if I end up in the grave just the same as a person who does good, the same person who has a legacy, and I don't know what's going to happen to my stuff afterwards, I don't know if they're going to handle it well, what is the point? 18, he doubles down and says, yea, I hated all of my labor which I had taken under the sun, because I should leave it unto the man that shall be after me. You don't get to take anything with you. Saw a really interesting photograph. It was a hearse that was actually pulling a U-Haul. You probably have seen that picture. You can't take it with you, right? Not really. And so there's the first part of the problem. There's the first part of his vexation and his spirit. that leads to kind of this self-loathing and the loathing of his labor. And who knoweth whether he shall be a wise man or a fool, this person that comes after me, yet shall he have rule over all my labor, wherein I have labored, and wherein I have showeth myself wise under the sun. This is also vanity. Now, he's not just saying that the legacy is vanity. He's not just saying that that's an enigma. He's saying that his very thoughts about the matter are an enigma. Even me worrying about it doesn't mean anything. It'd be really hard to be as smart as Solomon. Like, how does he live every single day with such an intellectual burden that he's wrestling with all the time? And now he's passing it on to us. And he wants us to wrestle with it too. He wants us to consider these questions. Therefore, and whenever you see a therefore, you always ask the question, what is it there for? Therefore I went about to cause my heart to despair of all the labor which I took under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is in wisdom and in knowledge and in equity, yet to the man that hath not labored therein shall he leave it. For his portion, this also is vanity and a great evil, that is passing it on to somebody who doesn't do well with it. That's horrible. For what hath a man of all his labor and all of his vexation of his heart, wherein hath labored under the sun? For all his days are sorrows, and his travail grief, yea, his heart taketh no rest in the night. This is also vanity. So even when you worry about it, even when you have lost sleep over it, when you have laid there at night thinking about it all the time, that doesn't even mean a thing at the end of your life. Everybody ends up in exactly the same place. So what's the answer? Because that's a pretty depressing place to leave if you think not even your legacy matters. And that's the truth. Your legacy doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the person's good or bad with your stuff, because everything is going to end up in the fire. Everything's going to be destroyed someday. Nothing lasts. We have all these laws, like the laws of thermodynamics, and Einstein once wisely put it, if it can break, it will. That was his whole summary of the universe. Everything will break down at some point. There is nothing better for a man than he should eat and drink, and that he should make his soul enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw, and that it was from the hand of God. He seems to be contradicting himself at this point. How can he say that everything is pointless and yet say that actually this is the good thing? Again, this is standing from a purely physical standpoint. He's going back to his original proverb, you reap what you sow. He's going back to his original assessment. I understand that doing all these things is good in the moment. We actually do enjoy these things as they happen. And these are good things from God. These are good. We shouldn't be disparaging about these things because of the end of those things, but instead we actually find that there's value in those things as we do them. So bringing up this proverb that he thought about before, even though he's worked out that ultimately it means nothing and everybody ends up in the same place, he has to admit that when we are enjoying the good things from God, that we should not despair in them. Because they actually do bring, although temporary, they actually do bring joy. And we ought to give thanks to God for those things, because they're from the very hand of God. So thankfulness is one of the answers that he offers. Then he says, for who can eat or who else can hasten hereunto more than I? In other words, who's enjoyed life more than I've enjoyed life? Trust me when I say that you actually can enjoy the things that God gives you in the moment, in these temporal sense. For God giveth to a man that is good in his sight wisdom and knowledge and joy. So again, the person who's walking the right path, who's walking in the light, who has his eyes of wisdom set in his head. But then he says about the person who is not walking in the way, but to the sinner he giveth travail, to gather and to heap up, that he may give it to him that is good before God. In other words, all things belong to God. Even your legacy, all things belong to him. But the difference between the sinner and the wise is that the wise enjoys it and thanks him. The sinner does not thank God and gives it up and is unthankful. because he realizes that all things actually belong to him. And then he ends with, this also is an enigma and a vexation of spirit. So, yes, he's worked out in his mind that the temporary things of life can still be enjoyed if we respond with thanksgiving and we give God the thanks and the what's the word I'm thinking of? The credit that he deserves. That all good things come from him. Every good gift and every perfect gift cometh from the Father of lights, where there is no shadow of variation, right? Every good and perfect gift comes from him. But the sinner does not recognize it. And this is a very important thing to remember as we move through the rest of Ecclesiastes. Thanksgiving is actually one of the keys to joy. Because we're actually not just thanking something, we're thanking God himself, who is good. God who wants to give good things to us in this life. But then he ends, and this is where it gets really hard. Then he ends, even after saying all that, but I can't ignore the fact, and I'm thinking through this mentally, I can't ignore the fact that the original question is still hanging. The question of death and of my legacy. Even if I give thanks to God, even if I'm joyful, it's still a mystery. And he still sees it as shepherding the wind, because those two questions are left hanging. And that's what we're going to spend almost the rest of Ecclesiastes looking at. The legacy and death. What is my legacy and what does my death actually mean? And of course, he wraps that up all at the end of the book. Hopefully we can get through quite a bit of this before the summer ends. Otherwise, we'll just be left hanging for the rest of our lives, I guess. All right, as far